Today, we are privileged to welcome Cathy Andrews, genealogist and adult services librarian at the Salinas Public Library. Cathy hosts regular online genealogical programs by way of the Salinas Library, and she is a frequent presenter at the Ancestor Roundup down in Seaside. Cathy will present her program today on how to research military records. She will show us the kinds of clues and details we can expect to find in military records from various eras. She will explain what types of records exist, where to search for them, and most importantly, how to make the most of them. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please do note, there is no handout for this program, but the presentation is being recorded and will soon be posted on the Santa Cruz Public Library's YouTube channel, where you may watch it again. Please join me now in giving Cathy Andrews a warm Zoom welcome.
Thanks, Gail. It's always a pleasure to be here and present to your group. I love teaching with 5 generations of teachers behind me. This is one of my favorite things to do. Um, so one of my goals with the Genealogy Basics series that I host at the Salinas Public Library is that for each topic that I cover, people go away with a sense of how to either get started or where to look next if they've already started using the resource that gets covered. And so today, part of what we're going to do is take a look at the military records overall, where some good places to find them. I've also got a couple of case studies that I hope illustrate the wide range of resources you can use to focus on military records. So let me get my PowerPoint pulled up.
That looks great, Cathy.
Very good, thank you. All right. So, as I was saying, today we're going to talk about kind of the kinds of record keeping that have happened over the years with the military in America, what the kinds of records, where and when they were put together, and where to find records, access to those records today. We'll talk a little bit about adding the information to your family tree as well. So, the most crucial thing to keep in mind when you're talking about military records is that where and when your ancestors served really determines what kind of records were created. And so, in the same way that nowadays we take birth and death certificates for granted, but 150 years ago they seldom existed, each phase of the US military or the military in the Americas has different kinds of records that were kept. So the biggest division is whether the records are federal or state records. And what that means is if someone was serving in a militia or in the National Guard, those are handled at the state records level. Occasionally, some of those records will be available in through federal resources, but almost always there will be some kind of state organization that has the records. The other piece is federal. If someone was serving in the military or was in the regular military, that's at a federal level. And so that's where you need to start for records. So that's kind of a crucial bit. Was it federal service or was it state service? And by state, let me just say that I use that as shorthand. Before America became an independent country, then much of the military work was pretty local. So the equivalent of state in colony records, sometimes it's town records. The other piece is whether someone was what is referred to as a volunteer or part of the regular army. So if someone had a career in the military, then they're part of the regular Army. If someone was drafted or enlisted, say someone who enlisted during the Second World War, someone who enlisted during the Civil War, they often are referred to as volunteers. It depends what branch of the service the person was in. You'll notice that I did not include Space Force because we're talking about ancestors, but somewhere down the road, ancestors will include Space Force. And then, even within the kinds of military records, there are some broad ways they break down. Are they service records? Are they pension records? Were they about a bounty that was offered to join? And those typically, they may be from the same, all from the same time period, but they may be in different locations. Depends which conflict or war it was. There weren't really personnel files until the 1900s. And so a lot of the information that's available about military records is because the work was done to index or transcribe muster records, mustering out records, hospital records that were um, part of a bigger package of records, but not individualized to the person. When we talk about research, especially for military records, what I'd like you to think about is that there are all of the government or official records, but there's also what I'm calling contextual records. Some of them may be records that were created at the time of the military service, but they're not part of the official records. They're also for pretty much any military campaign, military engagement of American troops. There will be web pages, books, YouTube videos, and many other things that help round out the information about the people serving in military units. And those can really make a difference in the same way that birth and death records tell you the starting and ending point for an ancestor, but understanding what was going on in their day to day makes a difference. Same thing's true about military records. A service record may list lots of information, some of it super useful to genealogists, some of it not as useful. But those contextual records or the contemporary records looking back at the military units can make a big difference in understanding what your ancestor did, why they chose to do what they did, what they would have gone through in their service. Let me also mention that in this, I refer to pension and bounty records, but those are actually have kind of their own um, uh, presentation. So this is an overview of kind of active military service, keying in with some information about post-service records, but mainly focused on military service. So again, the kind of service makes a difference. When the country was founded, we did have a federal military, but we also had militias. And in the days when the country, when the residents were still part of a colony, then the militia was where a lot of people did their service. So if you think of someone who's having an average life as a farmer, as a craftsman, as someone in the countryside, someone in a town, at different periods, people were required to be part of the militia. They would drill periodically, and then they would be called up. It might be for as little as several days. It might end up being for months. So one of the things to keep in mind about that kind of service is that it would be the same thing as if you and I were called up from our homes to come help with an emergency or something. We're putting aside all of our day-to-day duties and going off to help. In the early 1900s, the militias were all essentially turned into National Guard units, still administrated on a local level, typically through the state, with local National Guard units, but militia was phased out, National Guard was phased in. But both of those are the non-federal kind of service. And then the federal military is the other kind of service. When you think about your ancestor, something to keep in mind is depending on when they were born and when they hit essentially roughly 16 years old, um, that would give you some clues about if you don't know anything about their military service, because not everybody served in the militia. There were some reasons people didn't serve in the militia, but if you're looking back at some of your ancestors and realize that they were of an age that would have been called up during some of the early wars, that may give you some incentive to take a look and see if you can find anything about militias that were serving in the area if you know where your ancestor was. Um, that age range on the right-hand column, 16 to 60, not everybody that was serving was essentially firing a gun. Much like today, um, I have an ancestor who I saw was listed as having military service, and I knew that he was in his late 50s or early 60s. Well, he was a wagon driver. Another one was a drover, driving herds of cattle along that could be used for food. So you don't have to be of sort of most effective fighting range age to have served. Also, depending on who your ancestor was, if they were a big shot in their local neck of the woods, chances were good that they would have ended up as an officer. Typically, the officers were older, but there were way more privates than there were officers. And I'm not talking at all today about contemporary military records. If you or someone you know needs to get a hold of their military records, they can do that through the Department of Veterans Affairs. There's a form that people fill out to get hold of their records. And that's Mill Connect is a big part of getting hold of those records. So I did a quick look to see for records for the California National Guard in the 1880s because Salinas had a guard unit. It was a cavalry unit that was formed in the 1880s and was something that a large swath of the young male population, especially the sons of town leaders, served in it. And you can see when I just did that kind of simple general check, it came up with lots of different options for me. Family search, of course, is no surprise. Since we're talking about a National Guard unit, then the Online Archive of California is no surprise as another example. So Family Search, again, it has a list of the different kinds of California military records in the state archives. So that's one way I could go about looking for things. I also was able to pull up this is the list of the men who were serving at a particular time for the Salinas area. And it has lots of great information about where they were born, what they were doing, that sort of thing. So it's hard to predict ahead of time whether records will have information beyond possibly, say, age, birthplace, whether they might have something about family, but it never hurts to take a look at the military records with those things in mind. The National Archives is one of the primary places that one can look for information. This is a screenshot today of the front page of the National Archives. If you see up here on the top ribbon, the second thing in is Veterans Service Records. And then there's other kinds of up-to-date information because the National Archives is of such big value for genealogists. And when you click through to the Veterans Service Records, it includes everything from lost medals to requesting the service records. One of the things to know about the records that the National Archives has is that there are a couple of locations. Oh, whoops. I also wanted to point out Ancestry, since that's a place that folks use a lot. You can see here, if you clicked, I clicked on search, and there's a whole, one of the main categories is military. And I'll talk a bit just for a moment about fold 3, but there are military records that you don't have to go through fold 3, which is an extra charge to use. There are military records that are available through Ancestry without the supplementary, although many of them you do need fold 3 to access. And Family Search, again, one of the things I love best, if you're not using the research wiki on Family Search, whether you use it for your tree or not. So again, you hover on or click search, it brings up a variety of things. Down towards the bottom is the research wiki. What's wonderful about the research wiki is that you can search either by location or by topic. So much of my family was in New York State and Michigan. So if I want to know about military records for the Michigan National Guard, I can click through to the Michigan page and take a look, for example. But I can also search, when I typed in United States military, then you can see that there are a whole number of suggested kinds of records that I might want to look at there. And there's, when you click through, there's some helpful information about beginning research with the United States military records, kind of orienting yourself to what kind of records exist. And then in the wiki, Family Search makes sure to give you an idea of where you can find the records, whether it's a spot that charges or is for free. So that's useful information if you're trying to orient yourself to whatever the particular topic is. Um, there are census records. The military was handled different ways in the census. One of my things I'm trying to find, my grandfather, who's one of my examples I use all the time in teaching classes, served in World War One, was wounded and treated returned from um, uh, northern Russia to a hospital. He was from Michigan, so he was returned to a hospital in the Great Lakes area. And then he was still in the hospital when the 1920 census was done. That's the only census that was done with January 1st as Census Day. And he was not discharged until April. And the military that year in 1920 had their own, they were listed separately rather than as part of the geographic area. The hard thing is that it's not, the military records are not searchable by name in the same way you can search the 1920 census by name. And it's all using the Soundex cards. It's all been transcribed, and I'm still, so you have to search once you know what the Soundex is for a person's last name and how to use Soundex when you're doing searches. I've been through there, haven't found him yet. I'm looking at the actual physical uh, pages for the region he was in, and still haven't found him, but I hold out hope. So Fold 3 is a site. You can just subscribe to Fold 3, or you can do Fold 3 as part of a bundle with Ancestry. And there you're able to search by war or conflict. And some people find it extremely useful. Because I've done so much research on so many of the military folks, Fold 3 keeps showing me things that I already have. But there are little training pages, training videos about how to get the most out of searches in Fold 3. So if you do subscribe to it, be sure to look at their training materials. their searchability has increased a lot over the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. But it can still be a bit of a challenge the way they want you to look for things. So be sure to um, shorten your learning curve by using the information they have available. You can also, many of the folks who have YouTube channels related to genealogy will have Fold 3 as part of one of their videos. So you can also learn more about maximizing your searching efficiency in Fold 3 in that way. All right, so popping back to the National Archives, since that's such an important source, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth about the National Archives. So, Veterans Service Records, the screen should look a little bit familiar. We were talking about it. There's ways in to lots of information. One thing I suggest with the National Archives and many like the US Census history pages, all of these large sites with lots of information, even if you don't use a research log right now, use one when you're going into here, even if you're just writing down what you clicked on each page, because there are going to be things you want to go back to, and depending on what things you're clicking on and where it takes you, it may be hard to remember where something that looked interesting was. So if you kind of make your own personal breadcrumb trail by noting where you were and what you clicked on next, that will help you get back to things that looked like they might be important and not get lost, confused, discouraged. So there's information about requesting copies of older military service records. One important thing to know is that the pre-World War I records the physical records are in DC. The World War I and on records are held in St. Louis. And one of the challenges is that in the 70s, the St. Louis facility had a terrible fire. It destroyed a very large percentage of the records. And so some records, there may be a way to reconstruct pieces of the records related to your person if they're World War I and on. But you'd be extremely lucky if the record survived. It's a tiny percentage that did. Again, so the records are in either in the DC area or in St. Louis. And it's because of the volume. They just couldn't keep them all in DC anymore. Um, so there is, the National Archives does have information about what records are where and how to order copies in order to get them for both DC and St. Louis. There are some other things at the National Archives that are not the records themselves, but can tell you information. Prologue magazine was a publication of the National Archives, and there is a particular issue that was an overview of military records. It's 20 years old, but the historic records haven't changed that much. So sometimes you'll run across useful things like that. And there also are, the National Archives has lots of information related to genealogy. This particular page, it's going through the military records research. There also are pages that are, if you're coming in as a genealogist looking more broadly, and then it'll link you to the military records. So when it comes to the military records, when you get to that page, you can search by branch of the military, and then you can also search by war or conflict. So those are sort of the two ways that you can go to find out about what information, what records are available. And then you can also research by topic, and this changes out a little bit. Some of the topics will depend on current exhibits that they have, or records that they've been able to digitize and release, for example. So searching by topic, the page itself often looks a little bit different because they've got new things. But you can see military personnel records and historical military records are almost always there as two of the topics. So if you're looking by the conflict, just a couple of quick examples. Um, there's this, for example, is the American Revolution page. And you can see that there's links to bounty land records, judicial records, military service records. If you go in this way, the first time you go in, just click right on military service records as a starting point and see what's available there. And then you may choose, or if you want the only thing you want to know about is bounty land records, maybe start with that. But by knowing about the military records in the first place, that may save you some time down the road, so you'll have a sense of what existed, where it is. And all of those accordions will open up when you click on the little plus sign. Uh, the Civil War, here's another example. When you scroll down the page a little bit, one thing that comes up a lot is compiled service records. And this is what I was talking about when, because people were eligible for pensions, other kinds of things, bounties, etc., they figured out pretty quick as after the war that they really needed to have an easy way because you have to prove your service, right? And they need to be able to double check it. And so the compiled service records were done. There was a whole like bureau that was working on that to get caught up on it post Civil War, and there basically is an envelope and there's a list on the outside of the envelope of the identification number of the different documents that were found. And then inside the envelope is the specific information about that person from that record so that everything is in one place. So the folks who were responsible to approve the pensions or the disability payments had everything in one place when the service member or the veteran or the surviving spouse um, wrote in to claim or find out about what they were eligible for. Um, some people's jacket or envelope just has a couple of things listed on it, and they're listed typically just by a number. Um, but others have lots of contents in them. So there's a close up of a particular person, George Bowers, Pennsylvania infantry, came in as a captain, went out as a captain, and then the card numbers are related to each of the bits of documentation about his service. There also, I wanted to mention, since we're talking about the national level, that the Library of Congress also has some publications and different things related to military records. This is a book that's printable or downloadable as a PDF that are about military service records at the National Archives. They also, this is relatively new, it's just been in the last couple years, that the Yillingquist family, it's a father and sons who began collecting daguerreotypes of, they were in a location where at yard sales and things, you could, estate sales, you could find daguerreotypes of Civil War soldiers or related to the Civil War. And they started collecting them and ended up with a substantial number, which they just recently donated to the Library of Congress, and they're all searchable. And some people are identified, some people are not. Not a bad place to search. It's one of those you never know what you're going to find until you look. But if you can imagine being able to run across a photo of an ancestor who served in the Civil War, that would be pretty astonishing if it was not, kept in the family. There's also things at the Library of Congress, like this is the 71st Infantry Division. One of the members of the unit drew this map that shows their progress through Europe during World War II. If you can imagine, either, maybe this is something you print up and have on your wall if you had a family member who was in the 71st. Maybe it's something that you add to a family history book. But there are so many different kinds of things at the Library of Congress that it's a little hard to predict, but it's worth the look. Now, something that's relatively recent is that I want to go through a little bit to make sure people understand, because it's lots of people don't know about this, the Burls database. So the beneficiary identification records locator subsystem was a database for military members who had uh, either had were deceased, had claimed some benefits, might have been in a VA hospital, that sort of thing. And the Reclaim the Records, the organization, um, it's public records that should be available to the public, and they were having a hard time getting the VA to provide them. So they took them to court under a kind of Freedom of Information Act aspect. And in the last few years, they were able to have the database released to them. And it's a searchable site. It goes up into, I think, deaths in like 2020. So it really is quite contemporary, but you can find out about it's about older records, but the death date of the person can be as recent as in the last few years. It's pretty straightforward to use. Basically, they're guiding you through a quick search of the database. And then there's two different things you can do. If you find the record of the person, there's a particular way that you make the FOIA request. If you don't find the record of the person, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but you're making a different kind of request. The thing I particularly like about the database is that they literally walk you through step by step how to do it. They also explain things like it's not uncommon for a first search to come back with no result and a request for further search to turn up a result. So they're very encouraging of what to do. They've given some time frames. I don't know how the change of administration and the gutting of personnel, if what kind of impact that'll have on this, because I've just started using it myself. Um, I had looked for a while for Ernest, my grandfather, World War One service, and wasn't finding anything. So I did the request for records not listed. But I thought, you know what, I should do my dad. Um, he served was drafted in the early 50s, and so I like many searches, simpler is better. I had tried a number of different things with Ernest, my grandfather, and wasn't finding anything. So with dad, I just tried first and last name. It gave me back three results. It was pretty quick to tell when I looked. There's two Jerry D's in there, but the other one, clearly the birth date, death date are not the same, and the unit he served in, he was in the Army. So clicked on it, found out a bit more information to try to confirm that this was correct, and then clicked on the Start a FOIA Request button. Filled out the information, agreed to the terms. The VA has started requiring them to have an ink signature. You can see step 4 there that I skipped over. and you can use either your finger on a sensitive screen, or I was working with a laptop that didn't have a sensitive screen, so I did my signature with with the mouse, and it's reasonably close to my signature. But the Rescue the Records doesn't think that, or Reclaim the Records doesn't think that it's actually true that you should have to sign for it, but they are complying with that to reduce any chance of slowdowns. So, you know, reviewed the request to make sure the details were correct and then sent it in. And they gave me some timelines, like in the next couple of weeks. If I haven't heard back from them, then there are steps they say. And the first time you hear back from them is just to say that they received the request, not typically the information. But I just plan to put ticklers in my calendar every so often to remind myself as each step happens. And we'll see. There may be lots of information in the file. There may be very little information, but I'm not going to know until I receive it. All right, let's talk about some other sources to search. Some of these are going to be familiar to you. Some of them may be things you haven't tried or haven't thought of before. Obviously, again, ancestry with the military records. You can search by person. You can also search within databases by location, typically, to get you down to some pages to look at and see if you can find your person. If you're looking for National Guard or militia, then it's likely to be either the state archives for whatever state it is. The example here is New York State Archives, or it may be the State Genealogical Society, State Historical Society. Different states handle it different ways. There's also, lots of places that have information about things to look for at this particular website. It's military uniforms and photographs, and what clues you can put together to try to determine time period and what unit the person served in, that sort of thing. So libraries, especially big libraries, have what they call libguides to all kinds of different topics. When I was looking at the libguides related to military service, I particularly liked the New York Public Libraries. The thing to keep in mind if your local or state related libraries don't have a libguide is usually some of the information will be specific to the state, but there's lots of information in these libguides that applies across the board. And or if you had someone serving, in a particular state, you're just going to want to see whatever the big public or academic libraries in the state are, see who has a libguide. And you can see here this landing page, the getting started. Each of these tabs has information behind it. Like here's the types of military records, and you can see it's a general overview to help get you oriented. Another resource that people don't always know about, if you had someone that served in the Civil War, then the National Park Service has a Civil War soldier and sailors database, which, if you think about it, it makes sense because so many of the national parks on the eastern half of the U.S. are related to the Civil War. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in one of the case studies. Gail, how are we doing for time? I don't want to
We're doing fine.
Okay, good.
Forge
Thank
ahead.
you. Okay.
And to people who have raised their hands, we will take questions at the end. Thank you.
Super. All right, there's a couple of case studies that I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to move through them pretty fast because they both show a variety of ways that I gathered information about the military service of my ancestor. And part of what I want you to feel like today is it's not just, I mean, the government records are super important, but it's not just the government records. James Orson Andrews served in the Civil War. I didn't really know about James Orson until I knew back to my um, two times great grandfather, listed here as Alonzo. His name was Russell Alonzo Andrews, but he almost always went by Alonzo, including on some of his legal documents. But I knew about Alonzo. I didn't know about all of the other children, and I especially didn't know about Lorenzo Dow Andrews, my third great grandfather and long-term brick wall. So when I saw Orson, I thought, okay, who was Orson Andrews? And began to find out more information about him. Um, One of the pieces I found was about his father and mother, Lorenzo and Permelia. And there's Russell, my two great granddad, and here's James Orson. So, wounded during the Civil War, was in Andersonville prison. If you know anything about the Civil War, you know Andersonville was a site of extreme horror, with men starving to death and dying, living with inadequate food, no shelter, disease all around, etc. That piqued my interest. Was he actually at Andersonville prison? um, Began to find did all the basics of genealogy research for the five children of Lorenzo, including James Orson, and began to run across lots of records, many of them just in the day-to-day records of ancestry, that gave me information. I found out he'd also showed up. Sometimes he's James Orson, sometimes he's J.O., sometimes he's J. Orson. He showed up on some record as Orzul, so somebody who didn't know how to write it or misunderstood. And so there's information about his service, what units he was in, where he signed up. Um, Wounded in the shoulder at the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, due to the date, taken captive, exchanged, and discharged. So, okay, we know he was taken captive. We know he was wounded. Here's another one of the records. It's an extract pulling together a bunch of information. You know, when he signed up, when he was mustered, um, when he was mustered out at Washington, D.C. Some further information about Bull Run, supposed to be discharged from wounds, what his residence was, um, and at the time period, also born as, usually spelled Borne. It's the same as saying what we today we would say also known as. So on the records with some slightly different information. Um, this is a pension index card. So wife Susan, a date that the claim for him being an invalid was made, a date that the widow made her claim. So if I didn't know already when he died, I would have an idea that he died before November 30th, 1885, because that's when the widow put in her claim. Headstones information. Sometimes it's the bare bones, but other times there's a ton of information. Um, Here he is, Allegheny County again. It lists, Company I of the 27th Regiment, New York Infantry. The date of death is specified there. Who was supplying the headstone was specified. Looked for him in the Soldiers and Sailors database. And as I entered information and clicked off what state he was in, what service he was in, because there was more than one James O. Andrews. Eventually, it got to the point that I had my James O. Andrews. So click through to find out some information about the about him, and from there about the unit he was with. It lists what battles they were in. Obviously, he was in Bull Run, which was at the very start, and then was a prisoner. So that was the only battle he took part in. But it told me more about the whole regiment. And since regiments were often recruited in the same neighborhood, the um, Company I was recruited in Allegheny County, so there would have been lots of men that he knew, from the same locality as part of that unit. Um, Again, this is one that I showed earlier. I was really curious about the Andersonville prison claim, and so I just did a search that asked, where were prisoners taken at the first Battle of Bull Run in the Civil War, and that came back with some information. And one of the things it came back with was a Library of Congress photo. So federal prisoners captured at the Battle of Bull Run, taken to Castle Pinckney, Charleston, South Carolina. Um, so there's that photo, and I don't have any reason to think James is actually in the photo, but it really tells me something about a place he might have been held. Um, and there were a number of places. The more research I've done, there were several different places that the prisoners from that battle were taken. Started here, moved to here, moved to here. Castle Pinckney was actually a good place because it was on the water in South Carolina, and the prisoners were allowed out to harvest fish, crabs, that sort of thing. So they had a bit easier time than many of the other did because they could supplement their food. Here are the prisoners down here. Here are the guards up on the rampart. Look for more information about the 27th Infantry, and it was in the New York State archives, and took a look. One of the things was a list of all the men that had served in it. Looked through till I found here he says J. Orson. So here's some more information. Some of it I've seen already in other records when he enlisted. And his whole unit enlisted for 2 years. And those who were serving at the end of that 2 years, some of them went home, but others of them were transferred into the unit that went on from there. Um, but captured, paroled. The date he was paroled was not stated. He did muster out with the detachment at Washington, D.C. Again, another of the things on here, the muster roll, and I stop at this page because there's a couple of names that are going to come up. Henry Slocum, who was the colonel, will come up again, but I took a look at the enlisted, and sure enough, there's James. Here he says James O. Andrews. Took a look at information at Family Search about the 27th Regiment, and one handy thing was the different companies um, where the principal recruiting happened. It doesn't mean everyone in that unit was from that county. They might have come from Allegheny is close enough to the state line. They might have come in from Pennsylvania, for example, or depending on where they were within their county, they might have been easier to go to the next county over, um, depending on the geography of the area. Um, Found some other Civil War information, Civil War archives, and again found more information about the 27th Regiment. Also found this, which is very evocative. It's the colors of the regiment. Um, and this is post-war. It was brought home, and when it was replaced by a flag from from a local benefactor. But if that isn't evocative, cannon shot and everything else. Um, and then I was looking for information about about his death, I didn't know if he'd been part of the Grand Army of the Republic. For many men who'd been through the Civil War, they couldn't really talk to their families about it, but they could talk to other soldiers. And a lot of men were part of the GAR, but there are others who didn't want anything to do with it. So when I found this, I thought it was just so evocative. I wondered, since he died at a relatively young age, I wondered if it was related to his service. That seems to be reinforced by this. Um, and it says more, he went to Richmond prison, then taken to South Carolina. I don't know for sure, again, that he was at Castle Pinckney, but that's um, South Carolina is probably better than some of the other places he could have been. Um, and that the GAR post, the local GAR post, conducted the ceremonies. There are records for many GAR posts of attendees and different events that they did. Not all of them have survived, and I haven't been able to find the records for his local GAR. And then um, he was listed on Find a Grave, but there wasn't a picture of his gravestone. And so I did one of the requests. And one of the local volunteers was able to take a picture of his and the family's stones. And it was very touching to me after all that research to see the actual stone he'd been provided with. And if you know about military tombstones, you can see the rough outline of the shield here. And that was what the Civil War soldier gravestones looked like. Just wanted to mention, like, one of the bonuses I found was in the New York State Archives. They had some digitized photos. James Orson was not among them, but some of them are pretty. It's of the veterans in the Grand Army of the Republic. Um, and if I went through and looked at some of the other men that survived the war in that Angelica in Allegheny County area, there might be pictures of some of them as old men as well. I don't know. But it's just really, really evocative photos. You remember the Colonel? There's a whole nother set of photos that are at the Library of Congress that I went through and searched for the 27th New York Infantry. Again, didn't find one for James Orson, but found one for a couple of the different officers from that unit. All right, let me move rapidly through the World War One for my grandfather, Ernest Oliver Andrews. We had a photo for a long time of him in his uniform. He was living in Michigan, living in Detroit, drafted with a number of men who were from Michigan, from the greater Detroit area. And lots of folks have been able to find draft cards from First World War, Second World War. But I learned something. He had one finger that was off at the first joint already. Now, he grew up on a farm, and I know he worked as a logger for a little while. He also did auto repair in the early days of automobiles, in business with another man. I've been able to look up the location of 260 Trumbull Avenue in Detroit. I also wanted to point out, because in my looking at all the details, one detail about the World War One registration cards, this little front page, lower left-hand corner, if the person, because the military was segregated, so if a person is of African descent, tear off this corner. And that was how they kept the cards separate, because of the racial segregation in the military at that time. Found really interesting things. He had to go from New York to London, and then since he served above the Arctic Circle, after the rest of the World War was done. Um, there's lots of information I've been able to find. I was able to use this and actually look for a picture. There's the ship that he crossed on. And you can see this camouflage. Um, when you look at ships during the war and you see camouflage like this, it's not meant to hide the ship, but it is make it meant to make it harder for the enemy to accurately tell the distance of the ship. So hopefully, when they're firing their big guns at it, they would miss because it's more difficult to determine the correct range. Um, but you can see the size of the people down here. There are a few people up on deck. It's actually not that big of a boat um, to go. Hopefully, it zipped its way across. Um, because he was part of the expeditionary force that went into North Russia, which at the time President Wilson kept secret from the American people. That after the war was officially open, we still were fighting with the what were called the White Russians against the monarchists, against the Bolsheviks. And Archangel, he wrote a series of letters home to the family from Archangel. And when he was wounded in the winter, he couldn't be evacuated until the spring because everything was frozen. Luckily, his wounds were not so devastating. He was able to wait it out, but had access to situation reports about that war. And again, I mentioned the 1920 population schedules, the ones I'm looking through by hand. On some of the bases, they used the regular population schedule when in fact they were supposed to use one that was set up for the military and had things like their unit and their rank, that sort of thing. Most of them were handwritten. This is one of the few I've found that was typed. World War II, old man's draft. The application for the headstone marker, which gave me some important information like his service number, confirmed what his grade was. He got the Purple Heart and the Silver Victory Medal. My uncle was who was requesting it. Um, well, who it was going to be shipped to. My grandma was who requested it, and the local um, cemetery was who took and installed it. So here's the result of that. Because he was in the unit he was in were known as Detroit's Own, and they were also known as the Polar Bears because they were up above the Arctic Circle. And the veterans and their descendants have done a lot to memorialize them. So there are a number. This just and who knows, your ancestor potentially is part of or is remembered as part of another group that has to do with whatever unit they were in. So there's lots of different information about the polar bears. When the World War One anniversary, 100th, the centennial was coming up, there was even more focus on it. I found this. It's a little video when the men returned and to the Detroit area. They were greeted on Belle Isle, which is a river. I mean, a island in the Detroit River. And it was interesting to watch the 1920s film of them returning. Ernest was in the hospital at that time, so he was not part of this. But at one of the Detroit area cemeteries, there's a monument, and every Memorial Day, it still continues today. None of the survivors are around. Many of their children are gone, but those who do remain and the grandchildren and great grandchildren still come together at this site on Memorial Day. Um, so you just, until you start exploring, you don't know what information is going to be out there, whether you'll be able to access the official government records, whether there's much in the way of the contextual information. Depends on which war it is, depends on what the unit did, depends on how strongly the survivors, the veterans themselves, their families, historians, how important they felt it was. All right, I'd like to tell you that at the Salinas Public Library, we do have genealogy related books together in a unit. We also have, if you're doing research on Salinas, we do have local history information that's available. That includes clipping files that staff can help access information for you. We also have the Salinas Californian, back to before it was called the Salinas Californian, on microfilm. We also have a brand new microfilm machine um, that everybody's super happy with. We have yearbooks from um, all of the high schools, but not every year from every high school. Those are things you can access at the library. Salinas Public Library also has a genealogy work group. We meet virtually on the fourth Tuesday of each month from 6 to 7. We use Zoom. We have folks who are just getting started. We have some very experienced folks. Because we use the same link each month, we don't publish the link, but if you'd like to join us, which you're very welcome to do, then contact me for the Zoom link. Our next meeting is on March 25th, so several weeks away. I teach classes. I do 3 months on and then 1 month off. So I'm just partway through my winter schedule. And in fact, tomorrow I've got a class on using the census. The classes are by Zoom. If you go to our website and look up the date, you'll be able to get registered on our calendar. The information will be in there for the date. You can click through and get registered. And in April, I'm talking about immigration and naturalization. You're welcome to reach out to me if there's something that you think I could be helpful to you with, or if you'd like to join us for the genealogy work group. It's a laid back group. We have anywhere from about 6 to about 15 people. We talk about different topics each month of interest to the folks that are attending. I'm happy to, I mean, you've got a great resource right there in Santa Cruz, but if there's something you think I might be able to help you with, I'm happy to do brief consultations with folks. So you're welcome to join me. And if you'd like to know about the genealogy stuff going on at Salinas, if you go to salinaspubliclibrary.org and on the landing page, go literally to the bottom of the page, you'll see where you can sign up for our e-newsletter, which comes out every other week. And you have to scroll past all the fun kids stuff, but then you'll get to the adult stuff, and the genealogy things are always included. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and hopefully there are a few questions.